Thanks for coming and listening to our next presenter. His name is Martin Cotterell.
Hi.
And his CV says... Pardon?
I just said hello.
Oh,
that was
sorry. Huh. And his CV says, from electrical engineer to PV solar guru. And on that note, I think I'm going to hand directly over to you, and you can maybe explain why you've got this new title.
Yeah, well, I've only just seen the title this morning, so nothing like being dumped in at the deep end. But I've been installing PV for the last 15 years. I started off as an electrical engineer. After that, I worked a bit in Antarctica, because I think it noted it via Antarctica on the board. And then worked at Greenpeace for a while, just because I have a passion for environmental issues. And after a few years sort of working with Greenpeace and getting sort of frustrated by the lack of anything tangible that I could do, I saw PV was something I could actually go out and, rather than just talk about the problems, I could actually deliver a solution. So I started up Sundog 15 years ago. At a time, I think you could fit all the PV installers in the UK in a small bus.
Yeah,
and now you'd hardly fit them in this hall. So the industry has just changed completely since I started. I'm an electrical engineer by training, but I was also on the roofs all the time to start with, and I think as a consequence, because I had both those practical skills and experience, but also sort of technical skills, I got involved with writing standards. And
so you now set the standards for retrofixing.
Well, all sorts of things. I sit on the MCS standards, so I help write the PV installation guide, so that's an electric sort of guidance. And then I also involved with the roofing standards, so that's sort of working with people like the NFRC and NHBC, looking at how you mount modules, either new build or retrofit.
We had a bit of an issue here already this morning with a traditional roofer and his crew about retrofitting PV, and took you to task. I believe. It was getting quite heated, so I stepped back and I thought, well, I'm not going to get in the middle of this one. It was very interesting. He was adamant, as a traditional roofer, the way things should be done, and you were saying, well, that's not correct. But I'm pleased to say that you actually solved the problem by showing him some of the pictures that you had to prove your point, and he ended up being quite satisfied that your way was acceptable.
At the moment, MCS requires you to install an MCS certified panel, and there's nothing about the mounting systems really in any detail. So, but what's coming out in the next couple of weeks is a new standard that actually sets down the requirements for the mounting system, because obviously it's all well and good having a fantastic PV system, generates a load of electricity, but if your roof leaks...
Well, that's the problem. That's where the clash is. Sometimes people, clients, customers think, well, what I'll do, help the environment like you, for good moral reasons as well as practical and economic reasons, we'll retrofit some solar on our roof, and if they haven't got a proper installer to do it, they damage the roof. They end up doing serious damage to their property, quite the reverse of what they intended to do in the beginning.
Indeed. And the difficult one, the debate this morning is over slate, because, I mean, concrete tiles are relatively straightforward. They're robust, they can move them fairly easily, but when you get to slate, just the way they're lapped, obviously they're fragile, or they can be fragile, and they're difficult to get out.
Yeah, and also you've got the aesthetics. If you do have a problem and you have to remove some of the slates, you have to then, and if it's a fairly recent roof, you have to use clips, lead or zinc clips to put them back in.
Yeah.
And if you've got a nice new roof, you don't really want clips all over it. It'll look terrible.
No.
So I think in setting out the standards to make it simple and acceptable, has to be very transparent, what you're saying.
Indeed.
To roofers, and it's got to be in a language that people understand.
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing, we're going to be showing a series of photos to show, I mean, it's not just me saying that. I mean, though this is the way we've been doing it in our company for years, people like, roofers, have looked at it, thought about the proper way of doing it, and I mean, maybe the best way to think about it is the way it's evolved, because what started with slate is a lot of people were getting a pristine slate roof and getting their big drill and drilling from the outsides through the slates, breaking a few at the time, hopefully hitting a rafter. The chances of that, pretty slim. If it's a truss roof, you've got a very small bit to aim for.
Yeah, and if you're slightly askew, then you're going to be in serious trouble.
Exactly. So the very first version of it was drilled from the outside, load of mastic, jobs are good. which of course everybody thought, no, that won't work. So that kind of evolved into a system with a big rubber washer on the outside, which kind of improves it, but still 25 years weathertight. That washer's going to be moving around. Will the slates stay strong? I've seen it where the slates just crack over time. There's an awful lot of movement over the years of the PV panels. The whole thing settles. You know, it's very easy to break a slate. You won't necessarily know that it's happened until you see a damp patch on the underside.
Yeah, yeah.
So there is a way of doing it. You have to take the slates out, fit a robust, and I mean a robust, a very strong stainless steel bracket onto the rafters, and then reflash the slates over the top of it. It's slow, costs money, but it's the right way to do it, and it's, you know, it's kind of well recognised amongst the industry. But what's happened is that there's been a bit of ambiguity in the standards, but the new one will say that the only way you're allowed to drill is if it's a very thick stone slate, something like you'd see up where I live, actually. You know, some of the, you know, slates like this in the size of, you know,
Sure.
dinner tables, and you can't take them out. The drilling's the only option there, but that's
From
the
a health
one
and
exception.
safety aspect, will people be allowed, installers be allowed to fit solar panels from ladders?
Oh gosh, no. No.
Good.
I mean, you often see it on websites. You see these sort of people balanced over on ladders, and the next step up from that is sort of a scaffold tower, where if you're lucky you might land on the tower, but no, the only way to do it is a proper full scaffolding with edge protection, you know, because often you see beautiful scaffolding, but it's only the same width of the panels, so again, you know,
Yes.
you can fall over the side. So.
Right, okay, that's good. I'm glad we've got that issue sorted out. Well, I haven't got any more questions to
Well, I
ask.
can go now then.
What do you see? Do you foresee any problems though with the way we're moving with PV? I mean, one of the questions I get asked all the time is it worth me laying out, say, £10,000 now for the panels now, that in 5 years' time it's all going to be microscopic? It's going to shrink down in size, and I'll be able to get twice the power over half the size of solar. How quick are we advancing with the technology?
The technology advances fairly quickly, and efficiency, I mean, I must get asked about efficiency every week, because everybody thinks, oh, I've seen some article in the paper and the most efficient panels are just over the horizon. Really, it doesn't matter how efficient the panels are. What really matters is how much they cost per watt. And what's really changed in the last year is solar panel prices have absolutely plummeted. Added from that to the...
Is that because of demand?
Yeah, and it's just... You know, it's a volume thing. You know, there's just factories in places like China building them by their tens of thousands, and it's just volume is managed. You know, volume of production has pushed prices down. And the most efficient panels you see are on places like satellites. It costs a lot of money to get a satellite into the sky, and space is at a premium. But your average roof, the differences in efficiencies people are talking about, it's maybe that much difference in the difference of the array. It's so small. What you care about is how much of the system's cost per watt. Is it going to work really for the next 25 years? Because the feed-in tariff lasts for 25 years. It's all well and good if your panels work well for the first year but stop after that. And then the company that supplied it, both the panels and the installer, are they going to be around for the next 25 years? Because, you know, it's a long investment, 25 years. I mean, okay, the system will probably pay itself off in 7 or 8 years, but you know, hopefully you're looking at it in a longer period.
Are those guarantees in place for both the installer and the manufacturer?
Well, the manufacturer offers a manufacturer's warranty usually up to 25 years. So yes, they're saying, fantastic, here we are, we've got a 25-year warranty. But I mean, just last month...
Even if they're made in China?
Even if they're made in China. But two, I think 3 manufacturers on the MCS list went bankrupt last month. So it's all well and good having that warranty, but the company disappears, it's no use at all. So.
Right. Well, you're not going to be able to change that.
You can't change that, but I think what people need to do is I think people are seeing the MCS standard and going, right, fantastic, I'm going to get an MCS panel, an MCS installer. Oh, they've both been looked at, they must be brilliant. But the reality is you can't switch off your sort of critical skills. You need to still do some background checks on the manufacturer, and more importantly, probably some checks on the installer, because they're on the MCS list doesn't necessarily mean that they've got experience of doing your sort of roof. Whether it's the difference between concrete and slate roofs, or, I mean, we're currently doing a job on King's Cross Station, and we only need MCS for that. I could have got MCS on my mum's sort of cottage with her concrete tile roofs, and then I'm qualified to go and do something on a, you know, overhead glazing above loads of people in the middle of London. Now,
yeah.
in reality, the client on really big projects obviously does a bit more investigation. It's the sort of the 30, 40, 50 kilowatt jobs on factory roofs and things like that. When people look at the MCS qualification and think, oh, they must be qualified. But they're not necessarily. And it also doesn't cover all sorts of things, like the health and safety issue. MCS just says you've got to have a policy. It doesn't say what's in it. So, you know, there's still a lot of critical, you know, thought needs to go in as you as a customer when you look at a manufacturer or an installer.
We seem to be talking fairly negatively about solar, but I think the future is very much going to be around solar. And I think as we move on, when I used solar energy on the eco house I built it was in 2005, so it was 6 years ago. And we used the glass panels in the roof that matched in with the slates. So the idea was it was in a sensitive area, like a conservation area. So although they couldn't refuse us having PV, but they wanted it to blend in. And we mixed it in with slate. But that cost us at the time, and it only produced about 1.5 kilowatts, and that cost us £9,000 then. And we installed it ourselves. But it was a new build, so we was able to integrate it in with the roof. Would you say the integrated system for a new installation works better than these big panels, the pre-made panels?
Well, traditionally, our business was almost completely integrated because in the early days of government funding, it was all grant funded. So with a grant fund system, it didn't really matter how much it costed. So architects were getting very excited about integrated systems. That's why the UK's got a real rich heritage of some quite exciting PV projects. So lots of development in PV tiles, PV glazing, you know, stuff like you can see on the screen there. You know, replacing glass or replacing tiles. So historically, PV tiles were a really big part of our business, sort of 80% of what we did, and they look absolutely fabulous. However, because they're not made in the volumes of standard modules, their cost is higher. So it depends very much on who's making the purchasing decision. We still do a lot of integrated, certainly up around us on a new build roof. We've got a relatively cheap integrated solution that we will push because you haven't got all those issues we were just talking about, trying to integrate it with slate. So if you've got a slate roof, let's just put it into the roof. The flashing detail around the edges is much like a Velux. It's pretty well established. So you can get something that A, looks good, and B, replaces the roof. I mean, the cost of slates where we are is it's nearly the same as PV, you know, because they're traditional slates. So it's actually quite a cost-effective option in that sort of restricted.
I think that would be the way I'd go as a customer. I'd pick an integrated system because I wouldn't be happy with the way the retro installation or the potential damage done to the roof.
Yeah, and I think that's what most people are looking at, and that's where some of these new the standard I was talking about not only looks at the mounting of on-top systems, but it's also looking at the requirements for integrated systems. So it's got a whole series of wind, uplift, weather tightness, and fire tests that look at to making sure that a panel that you've just bought, I don't know, from Spain, you know, an integrated system in Spain isn't necessarily going to be suitable for the UK. We've got much windier and much wetter. So that there's a whole series of sort of checks and balances. And yeah, I mean, I know I do talk a lot about, you could see it slightly negative, but whilst I also run a company, at least 30% of my time is taken in writing standards. And I do see some of the problems. I mean, you were talking about cowboys with somebody a moment ago, and I ended up getting to see a lot of that. And, you know, my kind of passion is to make sure that, you know, that we're all playing from the same playing field, because I think it's a fantastic technology. The opportunities for both customers and businesses is huge, but we don't want it all ruined by a few people doing it wrong.
Yeah. So, in summation, really, where do you think we are now with solar, the technology? How much further down the line are we than we were, say, in 2005? I'm just interested because that's a benchmark that I can make, where we were in 2005. And now in 2011, solar's taken off, PV around the country and across Europe, I should imagine, as well. But how far... I know that there's more interest and we're selling more volume, so therefore it's come down in price. But technically, are we much further up the line?
Well, we're not. I mean, that's the strange thing. I mean,
we're not.
The mounting systems you were looking at back then are almost identical to the ones we're looking at now. Yeah, sure, there's a few small differences.
But the panels themselves,
what they
produce,
they're slightly more efficient these days. But what's massively different. I mean, I think from when I first started buying panels to now, I'm looking at something like a 5-fold decrease in the cost. I mean, it's huge, absolutely game-changing, the cost in panels over that time.
So I suppose the dropping in the price is twofold. That's what makes it more attractive as a financial outlay in the beginning. Yeah. And the shorter distance, you're going to get your money back in the long term. And you don't see that if someone makes an installation in PV now, that they've got a danger that in 15 or 20, say 15 years' time, that outlay is going to be undermined by new products that are going to be far more efficient. Because eventually, if we all take this PV on board, we are actually all becoming energy suppliers. That's what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
So if you take that to its natural one step further, and if we're going to be producing energy, it's going to be in our favour to have all the roof covered in PV, but working much more efficiently than traditionally the PV panels have in the past.
Yeah.
Someone said yesterday about farmers actually starting to plant their fields with PV because they're far more profitable than they would do if they was to plant them with cereal.
Yeah.
You know,
and we've done some of those installs.
It was made in jest, but there is some sense of reality to that. You know, and I think if we can get PV to work really well and actually cover a whole roof in PV that makes it look like slate or looks like tiles, then for a reasonable cost, obviously it's not going to be cheap, but then we can then all be a natural thing for us all to become producers of energy, and then we can tell the Russians to keep their gas, you know.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a couple of interesting things come out over the last couple of weeks is that the REA have just released some figures to say that there's at least 25,000 people employed in the PV industry in the UK. It's huge. It's a major employer in the UK. And because the industry is growing, because panel prices are growing, the cost per install watt is dropping. And everybody can now see on the horizon where, forget subsidies, the really exciting bit is when PV costs the same as it would cost you to buy normal electricity, and then all bets are off. Yes. You know, you can put PV on your roof, and it's directly, they call it grid parity. So basically, you're making your own electricity at the same price you would be buying it. At the minute, you have to be subsidised, and that's because the government, and the UK government's not alone, it's happened all around the world, is supporting PV to try and set the industry off. And it's been a spectacular success. You know, 25,000 people. I think something like 20,000 of them are in the last year. I mean, there's
Do you think when they reduce the tariff, though, that you'll see a drop-off in the uptake of PV?
Well, that's $1 million question, isn't it? What's the tariff going to drop to? And I think there's been a lot of pressure being put now because the government are thinking about it. Where's that going? And in places like Germany, where they've massive solar industry, where they've sort of real backbone.
Well, they're about 10 years ahead of us.
Indeed.
Same as the west coast of America, again. Yeah.
Indeed.
They have so much sunshine.
Yeah, what they did there is they tapered the feed-in tariff down bit by bit by bit, so they sort of weaned the installers off. The worry here is that the government's just going to pull the rug underneath for everybody's feet, and then we're going to lose
the business.
Lose everybody's, 20,000 people's employment is going to go overnight. Yeah. Now, hopefully, they'll be sensible enough to realise they've actually got a huge success story on their hands, and they've actually got employment. At the moment, new
it's all
areas
about
of growth.
Timing. I would say it's all about timing.
Yeah.
If you pull out the tariff too early, you'll undermine the business.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there'll be a drop-off in the take-up. Then that means the price of the panels go up, be more unattractive.
Yeah.
If they leave it too long, then it's slightly immoral that they're subsidising people and making lots of money.
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody argued that the rate needs to go down. I think what people in the installation business want is some sort of certainty. They want to be able to know where the government's going, so they can model.
It's got to be stepped, yeah.
So they can model their business. I mean, how do you decide whether you're going to take 5 people on if you don't know come April whether there's going to be any sort of feed-in tariff? So without that sort of certainty, it gets more and more difficult. It's more of a risky investment. You as a company sort of spending its money, but also, if you persuade somebody to leave their current job to come and you as a PV installer, only to find 3 months later that you haven't got any work for them. It's just not right. So what we're really, really calling for is for the government to think carefully about how they do this staged reduction and don't just sort of pull the rug from underneath everybody's feet.
There's one more area that I want to touch on, and that's planning. Right, as a PV guru, I've had, let's put it politely, I've had issues in the past with planners. Now, are planners generally pro-PV in sensitive areas like
well,
conservation areas?
We're in a national park, and when we first started, the National Park Authority were really didn't want to see it at all. But I think there's become a real general acceptance of it, and we're
currently... Is that backed up by legislation or not?
It is to an extent. Obviously, in places like national parks, it's slightly different. But we're currently putting PV on a Grade 1 listed building. I mean, King's Cross is Grade 1 listed, so, you know...
it's sort of semi-industrial, right in the middle of London.
It is semi-industrial, but we have done it on other sort of Grade 1 and Grade 2 listed buildings. We've just done it on a Bradford Cathedral. So, you know, there's all sorts of places you think initially, planning's going to be the issue, but in all the years that we've done, I don't think we've ever had a job stopped by planning. We might have had jobs slowed down or the design tweaked, and in certain circumstances they've asked for an integrated system. Certainly in the early days in the national park, they were only considering...
like they did to me,
yeah, they were only considering integrated ones, but now we can get away with the conventional modules like you'll see around here above the roof, providing it's done sensitively and put on nicely. I mean, still make it look horrible if you try, but you know, if you put it on carefully, you leave a nice border around it, it's nice and square, it's appropriate to the scale of the roof, you can still look good. And I think
it's always removable at some date in the future.
Indeed, yeah.
The only reason I asked that was to see, I'm looking at the overview that, for me, PV is the way to go, but I wondered whether there were any other barriers in the way, just so that I clear in my head that, you know, if we're all going in the way of PV and then the planners come in and say, actually, no, it can't be used in this area, it can't be used in that area, that means there's limitations to it. But it seems, from what you say, that PV is going to go one way, and that's
forward.
I
mean, the big barrier that is going to be harder to surmount is when we get to what they call penetration levels. So in other words, you've got lots and lots of PV
you
in
see how my ears pricked up then when he said that, yes.
Yeah, I should choose my words carefully, but the grid connection companies are getting a bit anxious now. So when they see 600 homes on an estate all getting PV, they then start having problems with the voltage control and the like on their network. So they have to think about how they actually cope with that added level of PV installation. So I think that may become a barrier when we get to large numbers, but right at the moment, generally, it's not an issue. We've had a couple of instances locally recently where we've had to scale down an installation because the grid connection company have looked at the size, literally it's just down to the size of the copper feeding the property, and said, well, look, it's going to cost you £20,000 to increase that bit of wire, and you go, well, it's just not worth it. We're going to put a smaller system in. So I think that's where the limitations will kick in on just the UK network. But other than that, you know, the technology's been around for ages and ages. You know, you were asking about 15 years. I've still got 15-year-old panels set in my property, still working. The inverters, the bit that turns it into AC, they're like any bit of electronics. Some will break, some will last a long time, some won't. But they're dead easy to replace. Right. The rest of it's just wire. You know, it's pretty straightforward.
It's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science at all, no. I mean, one thing I should say, and it's good to have a captive audience, we've just released a draft of the latest PV installation guidelines. It's on the MCS website. The whole point of that is to try and get people who are actually doing it, looking at the guidance, making sure that it's understandable, making sure there's nothing, you know, I've looked at it so much over the last few months that I can't see it anymore. And I think what it really needs is people who are still, you know, out there installing, reading through the guidance, saying, well, hang on, I don't agree with that. And there's nothing too significant, but there are a few things in it, like the mounting on slates. There's a completely new method to estimate how when you talk to a customer, you have to give them an estimate of how much you think it's going to generate. And, one of the other things I do is I get involved with some of the arbitration over mis-selling in the industry, and because it's one of those products that sadly is slightly open to mis-selling if done poorly. And you could talk up, say, right, you never have another electricity bill in your life. You know, it's going to generate all of this electricity, and you know, as a customer, you would, you know, you don't know whether A or B is telling you the right thing. So we've come up with a slightly more accurate method for assessing how much it'll do, because the current system is based on SAP. SAP just gives you one figure for north of Scotland to the south of Devon, and the new system actually allows installers to use regional data. It allows you to look at shading. Shade's the really big thing that will impact on the performance of a system. So that whole new procedure is written down in this new guidelines, and what we're really asking for is for people to look at the guidance and make sure they can understand it, because it kind of makes sense to us, but as I say, we've looked at it that many times now, it could be complete gobbledygook.
Right, well, that's lovely. You've certainly answered a lot of questions for me today. Thanks very much. Now, I just want to take the opportunity, if there's anyone in the audience got a specific question they would like to know, to ask about PV, and I'll come down. Don't be shy. I'll come down and thank you. There's a young man over here. Your name, sir?
It's Ian.
Ian, what's your question?
Got a couple of questions, really. I've been looking into solar for some time. Panel installation, do they all can be installed in landscape or portrait? And if not, why not?
It comes down to what the manufacturer says. So when the manufacturer gets their panel tested, they have to do these series IEC tests, and they state where on the frame it can be where it can be mounted. If you mount outside of those set areas, you could void the warranty. And even in practice, it probably doesn't make much difference. But certain manufacturers will say you can do it anywhere. Some will say it can only be on the long edges. Some will say it can be on the long or the short edges. But it kind of comes down to what your manufacturer will warranty. It's kind of one step apart from what may or may not actually work. But obviously, the last thing you want to do in 10 years' time is to be facing a claim on a faulty module and to find that you've voided the warranty because you didn't mount it in the manufacturer's instructions.
Right, okay. I've been checking through some data sheets, and a lot of data sheets don't actually tell you the orientation of the station. They give you the fixing holes, but you're saying that you can mount it that way if you like, as long as you use the correct fixing holes.
Yeah, there's some manufacturers let you clamp on the short edges. Yeah. Some will let you clamp on all of them. There's a couple of designs that let you do absolutely anywhere around the whole array perimeter, but you do need to read the instructions. And there is even some manufacturers that haven't actually allowed explicitly in the instructions for clamping. Now, I'm sure everybody who installs PV clamps it down onto the standard fixing rail. But there were, I haven't looked recently, but I know a few years back when I last looked, there were a few manufacturers that actually didn't warrant that. And obviously, if you're mounting it not by their instructions, you're probably going to be all right. But, you know, again, you don't want to be getting into trouble 10 years down the line.
Okay. Other question, which was on shading, which you just briefly mentioned. I've got an installation that I'm considering doing, which is going to have shading. It's not going to be avoidable. It's like a council-owned tree and things like that. And we can get inverters that will keep reassessing the power and retrack it and stuff like that with a PPMT. But there's another thing called Solar Edge, where each panel's got its own inverter on. Is that going to be vastly different in performance to having a tracking system? I
installed some of these, what they call AC module systems, when they first came out. There was a first iteration about 10 years ago, and I installed that on a customer. And he did some calculations and looked at the differences between what the worst performing module was and what the best performing module was. And I think he worked out over the year, he's gained something like 15% in output. I know it's a very hard calculation to make, but definitely they're a way forward, and for a badly shaded sites, AC module are a real opportunity. And there's not, I mean, there's UK manufacturer now offering an AC module, so there's lots of people doing it. So I think it is a good option. I slightly have worries about serviceability, because obviously if it's on a roof and if you have to scaffold to get the inverter off, then it's not a complete panacea, but you know, it's certainly where you've got a complex shading environment where, you know, half the array is in shade and the other half isn't. It does definitely potentially give you, quite a significant benefit.
Yeah. Okay.
What about pollarding the tree back really hard?
Well, yeah.
This tree does get pollarded, but probably about once every 10 years. I was hoping to get electricity every year.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's commonly got wrong when we look at sort of installers' bad practice is that people don't fully understand shade. Now, it is a slight exaggeration, but the way we like to explain to our customers, it's a bit like a hose pipe. You stand on the hose pipe at some point, the water out the end stops flowing. You haven't affected much of the hose, but you're still having a big impact. Now, it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but if you start thinking about shading in those sort of terms, then I think people will start treating shade properly, because it does have a very big impact on the output of the system.
And last one was about panel failures. People are saying, oh, they're 80% efficient after the 25 years and things like that. In your experience, do you get a lot of panel failures?
We've had to replace a few panels here or there. most of the time they've either been due to a manufacturer's recall where they've said, we've got a potential problem with some panels, could you come and replace them? So we've had to do that. We've had a few fail in the first month where there's been just a manufacturing fault, but we've yet to be called back in to a system that was poorly performing. And I suspect that may, we may just be lucky in that, and I know that does happen. But we haven't got too much of a problem with it, no.
This might be seem a rather simple question, a stupid question to ask, but how would you know which one of the panels, if it's an integrated system or a conventional system, how would you know which panel was failing? How would you?
Well, the way we do it, if it's a complete failure, we split the panel, split the array in half, find the midpoint, test each half, find out which half, and then just keep half.
Process of elimination.
Process of elimination. That's the only way of doing it.
So there's no easy way to do it.
You can do it with infrared testing and things like that. So quite often the faulty one will be a different temperature. So there are more sophisticated ways of doing it. But
it's a great question actually, and it's not a comprehensive answer, a positive answer that I would have liked, because it means aggravation either for the customer or for the installer to find out what the solution is.
Yeah.
Maybe they could, in the development procedure now with PV panels, they could take that into consideration. That
if you've got these AC module systems, you can easily tell because you'll get a signal from the one that's not working, and you can also get...
You get a what?
You get a signal, data signal.
Right, a signal.
Yeah,
right.
but also you can get... there is development of sort of module level monitoring that will actually do the same thing. So I think that's something for the future. But at the minute, it's not that difficult to find the midpoint. Usually the wires are easily accessible.
Yeah,
and
that's because you're a PV guru. Most of the time. Any other questions out there? Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I'll lower the voice. My name is Bob. How do you do? Basically, my question relates to physical robustness. I've got a general interest in learning about PVA for the company, but also a specific personal one. We're fortunate enough to live near the Pyrenees, and we get 1 in 8 hailstorms where we can get hailstones literally this size. How does one assess physical robustness and test against the environment there?
I don't remember the exact size.
What a great question.
But there is an IEC test that actually fires a hail stone of a set size and a set density at a set speed at the module, and that's one of the suite of tests that you would have to do. I could tell you offline exactly what size it is and whether it's exactly the same size, but it's exactly that problem. I used to live on a boat, and I remember dropping a huge adjustable spanner onto the top of a module and sort of bounced off it. They are actually very strong on the front face. If you get laminates like you probably saw on your integrated one, the side edges are much, much more delicate. And if you hit them on the side, they will shatter. But you have to try pretty hard to break them from the front.
Thank you for that question. Very good. Any other questions? There's one more question at the back there. Your name, sir?
Pat.
Okay, Pat, what's your question?
I just wondered with, the access from inside a roof, with all the insulation now that's required to put into a roof, how do you get at these systems from behind? Or is that necessary?
Well, normally almost all the interconnection of the modules will be underneath the modules. So if it was an on-top system, it would be over the slates. If it was an integrated system, it would be in the batten cavity. So you wouldn't necessarily need to get into that space unless you had a fault like we were talking about a minute ago. If it's a typical domestic system, there's probably just 2 wires coming up through a lap in the felt, and then all the electronics will then be mounted up in the loft somewhere. So if you have a problem, you've got to re-scaffold.
Well, there would be a slight problem if you were using the loft space and you had a vaulted ceiling. And you had a vaulted ceiling, of course, then you're going to have to make provisions for it. So it's about planning ahead. When I did it, I found them very easy to do because you just plug them in, they plug into each other, provided you get the right way round. And then when we plasterboarded out the loft, we put access points in. And there's not really any other way you can do it. But if you plan ahead of it, it's something you do. But it's a good point to bring up.
Yeah.
Because also with insulation, you've got a problem then of... insulating around an electrical wire, and and you'll lose heat, losses there, sort of thing in the wire.
Yeah. you obviously have to get the wires from the outside to the inside, and on a cold roof where you've just got an attic, a loft space, empty loft, you can just take the wires up through a lap of the felt. If you've got insulation under there, actually that detail is quite hard to get right. I mean, there are special products available that will allow you to put a grommet in and feed them through the felt, but to actually get it through there in a way that doesn't compromise the sort of the heat nature of the roof, but also more importantly the weather tightness, is actually not at all straightforward. And a good installer will know tips and tricks to get it through there. But if it is a room in the roof, you've got all sorts of extra problems. And one of the things the discussion earlier on centred about on slate roofs, it's all well and good drilling from underneath, like the guy was talking about earlier on, if you've got an attic. But if you've got a room in the roof, that's just not an option. So warm roofs, there's an awful lot to think about.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Well done. Thank you, everyone, for being such an attentive audience. Thank you very much.